I realized I was a sculptor, I think, in the early 70s. But I knew when I was 3 years old that I liked materials. And we lived on a farm in Montpelier after the Second World War, and there was clay in the creek, and I collected these tiny little clay stones that were formed by the waters in the brook. The clay was in the side of the brook, and it fell down and dripped into concentric shapes. And so I was intrigued by those shapes. I feel as if my seriousness about being a sculptor began in the 70s when I was in Paul Aschenbach's class. And he generated a lot of ideas. He was very creative and very good teacher, good professor. And I had done work with a small jeweler's torch. I worked in gold and silver and made rings and hair pieces and necklaces. But when I had the oxyacetylene torch introduced to me, that was exciting because I could go larger. And I didn't go that large at first, but I built the first maquette that I ever made into a bigger sculpture there out of steel. And working in steel is very permanent. It's not like ceramics. You have to plan ahead because you can't alter the design like you can, say, in ceramics. I really loved the material. And I was completely smitten with welding. I work in my journal every single day, and I record dreams, I record thoughts and all, but when I have an assignment to do a sculpture, every day for about a week I come up with one design and I'll record it in the journal. And then the next day I'll do another design, and for 7 days. And then I choose among them, and I'll have the design in paper or cardboard, or then I make it into steel, a maquette. But as I'm fabricating a certain sculpture, I will figure out how to do it many times in the journal. And I will ask engineers and mathematicians like Jim Brader or Bill Gottesman. Then my structural engineer is Mel Doherty. So I would run this by all these people and then know how I needed to design it. Not only for my pleasure of doing a design, but something that would work in a larger format. I had friendships with the assistants as well as with the engineers and the mathematicians, and then the welders. When I learned how to weld, I learned from the welders who welded on the St. Griswold trucks. And so those connections were very important to me. I always liked to make something a little larger than myself. And when I was first working, I would say that I would use pieces of steel that I could handle, and then I would put them together so that they would be, in the end, larger than myself. And part of that scale, when I place a sculpture in a certain place, if it's near a building or if it's near trees, then you make it, you don't have to have it quite as large, whereas if it's in the middle of a clearing, then it has to be very large to hold the space. The first public piece that I did is at the Fletcher Free Library, and it's called Kiss 2. In 1985, and I was teaching schools in the public schools in Vermont, sponsored by the Vermont Arts Council, and I met the principal there who was British, and she said, why don't we do a science art project here with these 6th graders? And so I thought for a minute, and I thought, oh, sundials. And I'd never made a sundial before. That was very pivotal at that point. What I did was I engaged the students to do shadows measurements of a vertical pole. This was in September, and we did it every half hour. We marked where the top of the shadow was on a piece of level plywood. And it turned out, with joining all those tips, every half an hour, was a straight line. And I thought, that's kind of unusual. And so it was an experiment that showed me that on equinox, which is around September 22, 23, 21, that the sun's shadow, the tip of a sun's shadow would go in a straight line, an east-west line. So that was interesting because that's how you could find what north-south was. If you found the east-west line, then you could just go off at 90 degrees and have a north-south line. I think I use, I'd use the stars and the sun and where I am on the earth and the latitude as an indication, a structure to go by. And that worked out really well for the first sculpture that I did in Stansted, because I was pointing to the North Star at 45 degrees, and then the shadow of the sun on equinox went, the tip of the shadow went east-west along the leg of the zigzag sculpture. So that was the alignment for that first piece in the World Sculpture Project. The sculpture is about connection. At the World Sculpture Project, which is the project I did with 5 different countries, the connection is the position on the globe, I guess you'd say. And I started with the World Sculpture Project up in Quebec, which is at 45-degree latitude. And it's also where my ancestors come from. My roots are in northern Vermont. My daughter was working in Hawaii. I think it's like 22-degree latitude, north latitude. And I had a friend, Helge Rutte, in Norway, which was at 60-degree latitude. So the connection there is a geographical one, and there's 6 hours difference between Quebec and Vermont and Norway, and there's 6 hours difference between where I grew up and Hawaii, where my daughter is. The connection with children started at the Colby Curtis Museum in Stansted, Quebec. And the director at the time, Sylvia Bertolini, suggested, why don't we make time capsules? Children from both sides of the border made little ceramic pieces, and we buried them underneath the sculpture. Then I thought, well, that can be part of the whole thing. And in fact, that was the reason the Japan Foundation decided to sponsor my sculpture in Japan, because of the involvement with children. So there were 2,500 children involved in the whole project in 5 different countries. And in Japan, Mitsubishi real estate company sponsored me to, they took me into different schools. And I think in Japan I went to at least 20 different schools. And they were young, kindergartners at one place, and then high school at another place. And I had to go into the classrooms, and the students were so friendly. And it was very fun talking with the Japanese kids. They were all very interested in America and what images. I asked them to do subjects of nature and what they loved best about their home and what were they afraid of. And I think that was the most moving part. Well, they were all moving, but working with the children was quite wonderful. They're also curious. There were time capsules for all the 4 other sculptures. And at one place in Japan, it was a beautiful ceramic round capsule and had a top. In New Zealand, it was a green egg ceramic, beautiful piece. And then in Hawaii, it was a very hot, muggy place, humid place to be. We used some kind of a pipe that was used for sewers, and we put a top and a bottom on that, and it worked in every place. We went back to each sculpture in 2015, back to each site, and there was a celebration at each site to open up the capsules. The best one was in Norway, because the lead assistant director was actually one of the students who had made a piece of artwork, and we put it in the sculpture. So he was able to call all the other students he remembered who were involved, and they all came, and they were probably in their 30s at that point. And that was wonderful. They were so excited. We took the sculpture out of the center of the cone, and there was a little bit of dampness with it. So we dumped it on a table, and things came piling out. And then they all looked, they were looking amongst all the pieces of paper and finding their own images. And that was quite moving. One of my favorite residencies for the Vermont schools was in Ferrisburgh. And that was just before I went to New Zealand, so that would have been in 2006. And a class in Ferrisburgh, probably fourth graders, I asked them to do portraits, facial portraits of themselves. Took them to New Zealand, and then working with fourth graders there, we made portraits of them, the New Zealanders. And the students were really fun in New Zealand. They didn't have as many rules as in other countries. They ran around barefoot, but in their classroom they did their portraits about the same size, and then we had an exhibition in New Zealand. We had an exhibition at the school of the different, the mixture of the two residencies. Well, I've always been interested in different cultures, and one of the reasons I did this World Sculpture project is that I was curious about other cultures, and it was a wonderful thing to live in Japan for 5 months one year and then 4 months the next year. But the other connection that I feel is really a cultural connection that is really important in this whole project is the Maori in New Zealand and the ancient Hawaiians in Hawaii. And they were Polynesians. It was the Polynesian change moving around in the Pacific Ocean. And family definitely influenced my work because my daughter lived in Hawaii, and she was able to introduce me to university professors and astronomers and archaeologists. She's an archaeologist, a full-time archaeologist in Hawaii. And it was very helpful, and she was there when we dug to find the time capsule in 2015. She was the first person to put the shovel in. And then in Japan, my son, and he was studying for his doctorate and writing a book in Sendai, Japan, at the university there, Tohoku University. And he speaks fluent Japanese, and so when my project was covered on television, and I would speak in English, and then he would translate into Japanese for the camera. And that was wonderful. And both he and Carol, his wife, were very helpful in Japan. Well, they made the introduction to Mitsubishi. Carol did that. And that was an important connection. Well, originally I was using an oxyacetylene torch. Acetylene is a fuel that is generated hotter by the addition of oxygen. And an electric arc welder with a stick welder, it's electric. It's hotter, and so you can build a better seam that holds the steel together better, and it doesn't warp it as much as using a torch. The only injury I ever had was dropping an oxyacetylene container on my foot and then a piece of steel on the other foot. Well, my career as a sculptor has changed quite a bit, but it's all been my life. It hasn't been separate from my everyday life. I guess is a good way to do it. And to see it all in one place like this, looking back on the 40 years, it's been quite affirming to me to see this all in one place and realize that my work has evolved and involves a lot of connections with people. I think the people are the big connections in my work.